The format for today is quite straightforward. What we want to do is to basically bring you all in to a discussion that Sarah and I have been having over the last couple of years, which has been really exciting and interesting. So it's going to be a very informal kind of presentation. We're going to introduce ourselves, and then I'll briefly introduce the conversation, and then we'll get going with that. So I'll start with myself. I'm Tim Waterman. I'm professor of landscape theory and acting director of architecture, history, and theory here at the Bartlett. I teach across the landscape and architecture programs. And my writing is largely focused on imaginaries, ways in which people see and understand and inhabit the world. I look at food and taste, and I'm also very interested in utopian imaginaries about ways in which whole worlds are constructed in the human imagination. And that, of course, stretches to building spaces, other species, and what have you. So the reason that we're here together is because there was, in the first place, a really great conversation that happened just as our work came into dialogue. So I became aware of Sarah Ensor's work in the process of reading Elspeth Probin's marvelous book, which is called Eating the Ocean. So, of course, I followed those citations and found Sarah's work, and it really ended up serving as the underpinning for an essay I wrote with Egle Paczkowskaite, which is called Avuncular Architectures, Queer, looking at queer futurity and life economies. So that was the beginning of a good discussion. And then, of course, there was an introduction and we began speaking separately to that. So Sarah, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you all so much for hosting me virtually. And thanks, as Tim said, to everyone who made this possible, Alma, Lo, Say, Jordana, Ben, Tim himself. As you may know, we were supposed to do this a full year ago and it didn't happen. So I'm very happy to be there now. I'm Sarah Ensor. I'm an assistant professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'm also a faculty affiliate here in the Center for Culture, History, and Environment in the Nelson Center for Environmental Studies. And very briefly, I'm currently finishing my first book, which is called Queer Lasting Ecologies of Care at Future's End. And in very basic terms that we'll talk more about, it essentially asks what contemporary environmental thought's seemingly necessary emphasis on the future has rendered unthinkable, and looks to two periods or scenes of queer extinction for kind of grammatical alternatives to the future as we often think we know it. I teach broadly across American literature, queer studies, and environmental humanities. And I would just kind of echo Tim's comment on citationality or citational practices by saying I actually came to Tim's work via the bureaucratic matchmaker known as Google Scholar Alerts. So because we live in an increasingly kind of quantified academic world, part of my task is for questions of promotion, I have to quantify my impact on the field via metrics, which means I have to count citations. So if someone cites me, I have to get an alert. And I got this alert that somebody in London had published a work adapting an old essay of mine into this practice of avuncular architectures. And that led me to reach out to Tim, and the rest has happened since. And so for me, that's just a really salutary reminder that amidst all of the metrics and structures of measurement that often can seem to dominate our days in the bureaucracy, there is behind or amidst each of those citations a person with interests and a relationship, and that so little of what we do is reducible to metrics. And yet even from that bureaucratic mechanism, this lovely conversation sprang. So I'm thrilled to be here. I should mention, Tim knows this, I've been quite sick for 2 weeks, so I apologize if my voice goes in and out or I'm not at my clearest, but I'm also very happy to take questions after our conversation or via email. So I hope this is just the start of something.
Great, and I should say too that for the audience here is mostly UCL audience, so you can find me as well in 22 Gordon Street. So if anyone wants to find me afterwards, they're more than welcome. The shape of the conversation today is basically in 3 parts, and it's fairly loosely held together. But we'll try to do those parts in relatively equal measure. So the first section, we're going to be talking about temporality, about dislocations of futurity. We'll be speaking about what is queer time, perhaps, what is the future, and how do we inhabit it. The second section is going to look at ideas of legibility. How are things read through grammars, forms, architectures, and through processes of method and seeing through the idea of the medium. The third section will go to the end. We're going to talk about terminality and ethics and politics relating to pandemics, apocalypse, death, and various futures, which in many ways, I think you'll see through our discussion, the queer communities around the world have already been inhabiting in many ways. So I think I can kick things off by beginning in the section that we're both interested, the section on dislocations of futurity, is that we're both interested in spatial and temporal contours of futurity. So Sarah is looking at, through the study of literature, the ways in which people are inhabiting spaces and narratives are running through them. And I think also in my work, there's very much a sense that spaces, narratives, and stories are really what tie together notions of queer life on Earth. So I think, Sarah, you were going to start off with a question for me.
Yeah, the question is both basic and not at all basic, which is where is the future, and how and why do you find yourself thinking about such a question?
I mean, the first part of the answer is probably fairly obvious in that I'm a scholar of landscape, so that I'm thinking very specifically about places, scenery, and what's inhabited. But I think that because landscape is really so much about relationships, I don't think we can ask about where is the future without kind of simultaneously thinking about how is the future. Because landscape is about inhabitation. Landscape is about moving through relationships. It's about the ways in which we live in the representations of possible futures that have been designed by people in the past. And these tend to often be sort of hegemonic futures, national imaginaries. They may be deploying the language of neoclassical architecture or something like this. But ultimately, in terms of inhabitation, it's all about practice. It's how do people move through spaces? How do they narrate them, negotiate them, so in simple terms, my answer to that is that there is a where to the future, but that where can't be in any way pulled apart from the how of the future.
And maybe a follow-up question is just, how does the queer context inflect that where and the how for you? What difference does the queer make?
Maybe it's good to kind of come to the question of queerness indirectly, in a sense, in that I think it's very useful to open the idea of queerness up to just oddness, that there's a kind of oddness or an otherness that is very useful for gaining a sort of critical distance, for being decentered, for being out of the mainstream. So that kind of oddness is a form of critical distance, is a form of being able to look at things that are assumed to be normal or natural, but yet to come at them with an understanding that you sit outside of that framework entirely. So the answer then really has to be that queerness is always existing simultaneously with the not queer, with the normative, with the hegemonic dominant narratives. And it's always a kind of mode of questioning, and there's always a kind of sense of survival that comes with that as well. How do we make it from a peripheral realm? How do we inhabit the margins? The question I have for you, though, Sarah, is an accompanying one. And I think it has to do much more about the temporality. And I think that you're perhaps better equipped to answer this question than I am, because you have so much better sense about grammar and meaning and semantics and the construction of narratives than I do. So the question is very simply sort of, when is the future, and how do we begin to inhabit it? And maybe, again, what is the queer perspective on the temporality of the future?
I have an answer to this question, I hope, but I was also thinking as you were talking in slightly different terms than I had planned. One is that I love that so far the way we've described the future is as a when, which is obvious, but also as a where and a how and a why. And the thing that most strikes me about that is that at no point are we describing the future as a what, which would mean at no point are we describing the future as a noun. And like one answer I would have to where is the future these days is it strikes me more and more, at least in the humanities, that the future or liberatory futures are everywhere. So even in my own field, we see this kind of proliferation, and it's inspiring and galvanizing in all kinds of ways of speculative criticism and speculative genres. And the goal is to produce ever more just futures, right? So in my own field, we have books like Amy Bang's Migrant Futures. We have Jerry Canavan's new Uneven Futures. We have Kara Keeling's Queer Times Black Futures. There are Impossible Futures. There are Old Futures. And it strikes me that as the future feels more and more imperiled, it has come to seem like a kind of commonplace that the job of the critic or the job of the activist is to engender a new one, right? Or engender new ones, often through speculative liberatory practices. And one question I find myself having about that, and it's not skeptical because I'm indebted to these projects, is just what other shapes, grammars, forms of persistence or futurity even are being cast into shadow by that emphasis on the future as noun or the future as what. So Mel Chen, who is simultaneously a scholar of gender studies and linguistics, has long made the point that turning things into nouns actually delimits their forms of possibility and their kind of internal complexity and recalcitrance. And maybe one way to turn it back to your interest in physical space and architecture is, I do think there's something to be said about the grammars of everyday life and the grammars of relation, and how casting the future or the futures as noun in some respects scripts or overly predetermines how the work that we do individually and collectively to bring those futures about. So a future can be a future as a noun, can be engendered, it can be saved, it can be risked. We can do all of these things to them through transitive acts of stewardship. But I find myself curious about other habits and grammars of relation. And I can back up a step and then I'll stop rambling, which is to say, I've been thinking about the question of queer ecological futurity, as it were, for probably 14 or 15 years. And it started for me because I worked in two fields, queer theory and environmental humanities, which when I started, essentially hadn't been able to meet. And they hadn't been able to meet in part because they had such hypostasized and opposite relationships to the future. So this was the kind of peak Lee Edelman moment. And you had on the one hand, the environmental humanists often investing in this image of intergenerational reproductive futurity. And you had Lee Edelman saying, fuck the future, fuck little orphan Annie. And the question for those of us trying to bring these fields together was, are those approaches ever reconcilable? And what would that look like? And my answer in 2010-ish, which was the article that you found, Tim, was to try to suture these opposed relationships to the future by picking up or turning to a figure, which was the spinster or the aunt figure that was kind of unaccountable within each of those models. But what emerged from that was actually the spinster as a kind of grammatical alternative, because one thing I noticed was that whether the logic was, let's save and steward the future in the name of the innocent white child, right? Or if the logic was fuck the future, fuck little orphan Annie. Again, both of those approaches cast the future as the kind of tangible object of our transitive acts. And for me, the spinster via Rachel Carson was so powerful because Carson's writing was embodying all of these kind of intransitive modes of persistence. I will say that since I wrote that piece, I've actually become less and less invested in futures and less invested in the future, and really curious about histories within queer culture, both in the 1890s and the 1980s, where various forms of care and lasting become possible in what 19th century literature would call at the last. So at the end of life, at the end of the family line, amidst the last member of a species, at the end of a temporary encounter. And so these days I'm less thinking about futures or futurity than about kind of grammars of lasting that too readily get cast into the shadow by our collective emphasis on futures as we think we know how to think them.
The question of futures as plural, I think, is really important. When we speak about the future, it's assuming that, you know, time's golden arrow is going to lead us to one teleological conclusion. And of course, there are many futures. I think that sense too of the future being foreclosed also kind of hinges upon that singularity of vision, that there is only one future, that time only has one arrow that we can possibly arrive at. And Lee Edelman, whose work you mentioned, and whose book is called No Future, kind of assumes in a really polemic way that because queers are not reproductive, that we owe nothing to the future, and therefore we'll all party like it's 1999. And I think that was felt really deeply by queers who were reading his work. It was like, yeah, you know, we don't have this responsibility. We don't have the burden of the future that other generations did. And I think there was very much a sense, and you know, growing up in the 1980s, there was a sense of mortality that was ever present. You know, living in the atmosphere of the great pandemic of AIDS, I think led a lot of us to live as if there was no tomorrow. But Edelman kind of paints that as something that's liberatory and ecstatic, and he speaks about jouissance. So there's a kind of orgasmic nowness about what Edelman is presenting. And that's not quite how I remember it. I mean, there was a lot of fun, but there was also a kind of sense of desperation. And I don't think my younger self expected to live to old age. So I'm still kind of surprised to find myself here, and pleased in a way. And also, I think that you know, those kind of expectations of the future were also something that straight parents were very, very aware of as well. That when your kids came out to you, it was not just, you know, oh no, you know, my child is going to have an unhappy life, but also perhaps, you know, my child is going to have a short life as a result of the world that they are entering into. So I think that there's a tension there between, you know, kind of the reproductive futurity on the one hand and the nihilistic world that the queer is supposed to be entering into, and in many ways in the 80s kind of did enter into.
Yeah, I at some point in this conversation, I would love to talk about aging. queer surprise at its own aging, by which I mean kind of individual people's surprise at growing old, but also kind of queer theory as a field, not knowing what to do with its own kind of maturity, right, or reaching adulthood as a discipline. But as you were talking about this kind of experience of the 80s vis-a-vis Edelman's orgasmic no future, I was just thinking, I mean, one reason that I'm so drawn to lasting as a term is I just feel like, for me, the brilliance among the many brilliances of queer culture, one brilliance is simply or precisely that in the absence of normative or reproductive or biological futures, queerness has found so many ways to last, right? And I mean that both like there are so many forms of survival and thriving in queer culture that are not about obviously kind of straightforward biological reproduction, but also that queerness as a field, as a posture, as a practice, as a political and hermeneutic project has just so long been intimate with futurelessness, right? And you can think about that in any number of ways. Queerness as a kind of anti-identity category is defined, at least in part, obviously, by its non-reproductive eroticism, by the fact that queerness is not invested physically, relationally, in intergenerational continuance of biological life, right? But then we also have the kind of intimacy of queerness emerging in these scenes of foreclosure, right? So whether you think about queer theory emerging as a kind of political response amidst the HIV and AIDS crisis, so the origin of queer theory being so intimate with these scenes of death or the presumption of non-survival or fear of non-survival, or kind of conversely, that the 1890s, which coincide with the birth of the homosexual as a species, led to the foreclosure or the extinction of all kinds of forms of relational possibilities, right? It just feels like in queer culture, in queer theory, in queer life, you can never kind of separate what I'm thinking of as those two forms of lasting, right? Like persistence is always wrapped up with the feeling of kind of being at the end or being at the last. And for me, that's kind of very much in keeping with that duality that you're talking about.
Yeah, that question of lasting. Now, we Sarah and I both last night watched Agnes Varda's wonderful film, The Gleaners and I. Has anyone seen the Gleaners and I? Okay, so some of you. Any Agnes Varda films? Okay, actually, that's great because you're in for a treat. They are really, really wonderful films, and I think Sarah and I have both watched probably most of them, and she really feels like an auntie, and that's the way she presents herself in these films. And there's a queerness to her existence too, because she was married to Jacques Demy. Jacques Demy died of AIDS, was the director of The Umbrellas of Cherbourg. And so she's made films about her relationships with Demy, but she also shows such incredible evidence of care for people that are on the margins. And this is precisely what the Gleaners are doing in The Gleaners and I. They're people who are scavenging for food in fields. They're people who are taking food out of bins. They're, freegans, as we call them now. And she gets really intimate with them. And she presents herself in a way that is very intimate, and that sense of lasting is something that's really pertinent. There's one scene in the film where she's an elderly woman and she's brushing her hair, and you can see where the gray roots are visible, and where she's colored her hair, and that the hair is thinning as it does with age. And then she looks at her hands, and you can see the wrinkles on her hands. And there's a sense that she's lasted. And in her films, there's always a kind of haunting of Jacques Demy, right? So she has outlasted her husband. And she shoots herself in these films with the same kind of tenderness and openness that she films her husband when he's dying. So that question of lasting also becomes a question of outlasting, of surviving. And it's what's beautiful to me is that she's able in these films to confront it with such care and without, you know, sort of histrionics or anything. She's just like, look at my hands, I'm aging. It really, it struck us both this time when we watched it together.
I had two thoughts as you were talking, and then I want to go back at some point more directly to the filming of her own aging. But one is, as you were talking, a word came to mind, which is there's now this word that has been coined or adapted to the last living member of a species, right? So picture like Martha, the passenger pigeon in 1914, or animals who are the last in a species line now. And the term is endling, and that term has been applied to species logic, but it originally meant the last member of a family line, which to me is the not uncommon predicament of the queer adult, to be the last member of the family line. And there is a sense, you know, that's not necessarily true for Varda, but I do, after hearing you describe that scene, think of like, what would it mean to understand that as a meditation on being an endling, but also kind of on, as you're saying, the relational and ethical affordances of that, right? Of being one who is outlasting and is somehow like obsolete or residual, but still present and still creating and still engendering various things. And the other thing I was thinking of when you brought the film up was something I had meant to mention after your first meditation on queerness, and I apologize, my mind is never fully with me in the kind of hybrid Zoom format since there aren't bodies to help me track my thinking. But your response when I asked why queerness, I thought was really compelling, because even before you talked about oddness, you said something like queerness is a mode of indirect relation, right? And we can say like indirect relation to all kinds of things, including, of course, normative structures that you're both within and without, and hence can yourself defamiliarize and inhabit differently. But I was thinking about indirectness in relation to Varda, in part because the whole premise of gleaning as a practice, and one of the very first things that she says in the film, right, is that gleaning necessarily comes after the harvest, right? So it needs to have had the event, and then you're persisting in the kind of aftermath, and it's precisely being belated that makes gleaning possible, right? So one thing to say is, it does strike me, and I think this is linked to futurity, in part because I think ultimately what you and I are both trying to negotiate is less futurity than like the capaciousness or bagginess or tilting of the present. And I think for her, there's a way in which she is inhabiting something like a belatedness that is not a too lateness, right? And I think that's a really difficult posture to learn to live with, which is like, especially with regard to global climate change and environmental crisis and environmental injustice. Like, there's no denying the fact that we are, and this is like a complicated many of us are understanding ourselves to be arriving to a problem late, right? But it's like a lateness that is not a too lateness. And this isn't the main emphasis of my work, but as you're talking, I'm just thinking about, I am really interested in the slivers of possibility, like where the light shines between the late and the too late, right? And I think understanding this film as a kind of meditation on belatedness that is not elegiac and is maybe not utopian, right? But is like being willing to sit in that space with the gleaners, with the aging hand, with the rotting fruit, and figure out what forms of ethical relation, right, and action become present there. And last thing I'll say is the other reason I thought of that is that there's been a lot of talk among queer theorists of my approximate generation, which is you know, someone born in the early 80s. And so not alive for the moment in the same way, about like, what does it mean to have a kind of indirect relationship to this pivotal moment, galvanizing political moment in queer studies. So Kaji Amin has written about this, Lucas Hillebrand has written about this. And I think just to say like indirectness, especially if you're taking queerness as a synonym for kind of indirectness, need not be a liability. That can be a mode of relation. And I think about that because for me, thinking about grammar, on the one hand, I believe on like the political power of grammar as a technology of thought, in keeping with a lot of other scholars. On the other hand, like I'm also interested in grammar because literary grammar is not the world, and literature is in a kind of necessarily fundamentally indirect relationship to the world. And I am curious, like, if we lean into indirectness, as you were doing, Tim, up front, what we might learn. And I think for me, there's a kind of linkage between belatedness and indirectness and what those can facilitate.
For us in architecture planning, landscape architecture, the standard practices are almost the opposite of what we've been talking about in terms of lasting and indirectness. There's a whole lot of firsting, right? You've got to be the first person who's ever done this form. You've got to be the first person who's introducing something. And there's a very solution-based approach to things. So let's define the problem. It's an equation. Let's solve it. That notion of intransitivity, that kind of critical distance, what the figure of the spinster and what the avuncular figure, the aunt or the uncle, introduces is a critical distance that's not so distant it allows you to act without moral judgment. So maybe the extreme example of that would be someone who's drone bombing people and it looks like a video game. So there's a kind of distance there that doesn't allow you a connection to the subject. Whereas the place of the aunt or the uncle is a position of care. It's a position that's, kind of within the family, but you're not directly fathering or mothering something into existence. You're there as part of the development of a species, of a space, of relationships. So I think that's really, really important. So the place of the aunt or the uncle in this equation isn't to bring something new into existence. It's to shepherd, to tend, to look on from the sidelines, to look on with care, to be involved. So I think it's a really, really good figure, and it figures very large in both your work and mine. I think this avuncular approach, that there's in the way that Lee Edelman says there is no future, I think he's also denying the past, that you're living in this eternal present where anything goes, and yet in real life the relations that we have are much richer than that, and there is a lot from the past that you want to pull into the future. And I think there's one more kind of relation that perhaps I might be jumping ahead, but this speaks to terminality, is in the ways in which queers cared for each other in those first years of the AIDS epidemic, which was volunteering to look after people whose families may have abandoned them. And when you hear people telling those stories of volunteering now, they're very much talking about the people that they saw. So they're carrying those stories forward into the world. They're remembering the people who died. So it's not just an altruistic act of volunteering because you want to care. It's actually because those stories matter. There's something about the whole of those existences that need to be transmitted to the future.
Yeah, I would love to, I'm going to kind of put a pin in the question of the work of volunteers in the face of institutional abandonment, which I think is relevant to the final scene of The Gleaners and I, which features a man doing volunteer teaching in the basement of the shelter in which he too lives in Paris. So I do want to go back to that, but I wanted to kind of take a quick step back just to reflect on your really compelling meditation on avuncularity, because again, the more we talk, it feels like what we're really trying to figure out, and I would love to have a conversation about this with the whole group, is just what it means to not only ethically inhabit this kind of more capacious present, but also the question of like where we locate possibility. Because for me, part of the the burgeoning turn to kind of futures and futurisms does strike me as our collective hope for possible like elsewheres and otherwises, right? Other ways of inhabiting often the unjust present. But one thing that you are calling attention to, I think, via the avuncular is if you take, like what Sedgwick says about the avuncular, it's not just that the avuncular is a kind of a slant or a slant-wise relation within a family, but one of the things she says that to me is so powerful is that, and I don't have it memorized, but something like knowing your aunt and uncle is a way of knowing that your parents could have turned out otherwise, and indeed recognizing that they in fact may already have done so, right? So it's not just that they could have been otherwise, but that the present itself is often multiple, non-self-same, different than we think. And the avuncular being then just becomes like an index, right, of all of these other things that are already present in the present. And so I'm kind of interested in what it means to understand the present as just populated with all of these kind of, to borrow Elizabeth Freeman's language, like undetonated possibilities from the past, and then what it means to understand the present as containing not just what the past kind of could have been, but what the past in fact already has become, right? But that's often being rendered illegible by the hegemonic structures you were talking about. So kind of the question of legibility seems really important. Like what mechanisms do we have to make these other possibilities that are here or other forms that are persisting kind of underground legible to us? And I don't just mean that in an academic sense. I mean, like how do we make them livable, and how do we learn to live together with and through them?
Well, I think from a queer perspective, legibility is really important. I mean, in the 80s, we talked a lot about visibility. So it was really important to be wearing my Queer Nation stickers around and to be visibly queer. But a great part of the history of queer life has actually been the opposite. It's been illegibility and making sure that your actions were not readable. So, for example, you had in Britain, you had polari or parlieri, which was the argot or cant, which allowed people to speak. And it's sort of cliche now, lovely to vada your eek, but that was a way of operating when queerness was purely criminality in the eyes of the law. So there is a kind of tension, I think, between legibility and illegibility, and it's a tension and a simultaneity that I think is useful, referred to as the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, that we live in worlds in which conflicts are ever present and must be balanced. They can't be resolved. So what is made legible and what is obscured are happening kind of in the same moment.
Yeah, and not to go back to I want to ask you about utopianism in the context of all of this, so don't let me lose track of that. But as you were talking, I was thinking that actually might be another reason I'm interested in grammar, which is essentially a condition for legibility, but not itself legible, right? So grammar is a function, a part of a text that is never itself anywhere stated on the page, but makes things legible, right? Or makes possibilities legible precisely by not being said, but by being the condition or the shape in which other things are said. So it may be that the kind of grammatical for me is that infrastructure of the kind of like binary or dualism that you're speaking of being simultaneously legible and unreadable. It's not kind of readable as itself. It's the condition for something else's ability to kind of emerge into legibility or recede from it. And it also for me, and this is getting too far into the weeds, so I won't get into it, but like it does permit the telling of two temporalities simultaneously, or the telling of two stories simultaneously. The reason that I thought about utopia at this moment, Tim, and you can tell me if I'm jumping too far ahead, is I was also thinking about some words that kind of have come up and strike me as helping get at the present as I think you're thinking about it, which are the terms like still and already, right? So it feels like if part of what you're talking about is a kind of like tilt of a thing that we call the present, part of what you're talking about is like what from the past is still present, still residual, still able to be activated, still live. And then it also seems, especially in the utopian thinking or the prefigurative thinking, part of it is about making a break, I think, from the present, but part of it is about like accessing the question of like, how do we discuss what's already here, right? But perhaps not yet fully coate or legible. So I'm just curious if, and you know a lot more about utopia than I do, but if this is a moment to bring that term in.
Yeah, let me see if I can address all the areas of that point, because there's so much there to build upon. In terms of utopias and in terms of writing about the future, actually, this brings us almost back to the very first points that we were discussing about the future being this kind of transitive teleological thing. Ursula Le Guin, when she speaks about the way that she writes science fiction, she's always accused in her life by people saying you're writing about the future. And she says, I don't write about the future. I write parallel allegorical worlds, which act upon the existing world. And that is very much the function of the utopia, I think, in literature and in film, that what utopias do first is they allow us to think whole worlds all the way through. They allow us to introduce possibilities like, what if there aren't any humans? What if there are other genders? What if there are, all of these possibilities are, you can explore them in utopias, and not just as isolated components, but as part of a larger working system, which is really, to me, the important kind of where and how of futurity, not just where is it, but how does it operate and how might it operate differently? Tom Moylan, in his book Demand the Impossible, writes about the critical utopia, and this is very important in utopian studies and utopian theory. The idea is that the critical utopia functions as critique. It allows us to critique whole worlds kind of all at once, but it also has critical mass in the nuclear sense to shift the world, to change things. And this is also part of the really important sort of activist function of utopias. They posit new worlds. They posit whole new ways of being and acting. They create, in architecture, new forms that might be inhabited, that we can question as well. So the anti-utopian impulse, which is so present in politics, we were talking on the way into the room about Margaret Thatcher and the idea that there is no alternative, Tina, to economic liberalism. That's a form of anti-utopianism. That's really saying that the neoliberal, economic liberal utopia is the only one that's possible. So that's this teleological kind of future again. It's Thatcher saying there is only one possible future, and it's ours, it's not yours. What else haven't I quite answered?
No, that was great. I mean, as you were, I had two thoughts as you were talking, maybe minor points, but one was when you were speaking of utopianism as demanding the impossible, I was thinking of this book by Eric Kasdan called The Already Dead. It's actually about kind of like insisting upon terminality as opposed to chronic illness, because logic of the chronic is a kind of way of managing the status quo. And he's speaking of his own experience of having what was once a terminal illness become a chronic condition because of a shift in medication, but that he saw a kind of like power of rupture in terminality. And he thinks the kind of like managerial economy of the chronic dilutes that power. But in that book, he talks about like the importance of making change by any means possible and making change by any means impossible. So maybe one of my questions is like, what does it mean to make change by any means impossible? And what's the temporality of that? Is that a futural project or a kind of more present prefigurative project? But to back up a step, as you were talking about the first utopian impulse being insisting upon like what could be, right? And that what is not the end all be all or the inevitability or natural. That too is a grammatical question, because essentially what you're insisting upon is demanding something like the conditional, right? What could be, what could have been, and insisting, I think, to go back to Sedgwick on the avuncular, that in fact the indicative, like what is, right, is cross-hatched in all kinds of ways already with what could have been and what could be, right? And so part of the question, I think, is like how to live a life that is simultaneously indicative and conditional or subjunctive, right? How to kind of like inhabit the day-to-day with that utopian insistence on what could have been, what could be. So Lisa Lowe, in The Intimacies of Four Continents, at the end of the book, she talks about like the power of a historical imagining that takes seriously the past conditional, like insisting upon what could have been, which is insisting upon like the present itself is not inevitable. And one way to access those presents otherwise is to kind of pick up those unrealized possibilities from the past. So I think all I'm picking up on here is that so much of what you're saying about utopian thinking does seem to rely on the richness of the present and the past.
The question of the not yet, of that which hasn't yet arrived, is something that comes up in the writing of Ernst Bloch, and it gets picked up by Jose Esteban Munoz as well in Cruising Utopia, which is a fabulous book. But I think even that framing needs to be questioned. And I was having discussions recently. I had one of my master's thesis students in architecture was writing about wetlands. And wetlands, of course, are immensely productive, but they are also places of constant death. That you know, in a wetland, you have death collapsing into life in a way that is just like so embroiled, that we were looking for the ways of describing that, you know, that wetlands are a place where the not yet is always already not quite here, or something, you know. There was so much conditionality built into conceiving of wetlands and the way that they figure as a model for existence that is so different from that golden arrow of teleology, and a much more ecological way of thinking about how possibilities are always springing to life and always trying again as well. So you know, the idea that something, how many meetings have I been in over the years where someone says, oh, we've tried that. Well, you tried that in a moment, but this is another moment. So, you know, the conditions of possibility have shifted, and ideas can keep coming back like waves, or you know, like species in a wetland, they can continually be reborn. So that's a very different kind of image of the future, or a future.
I was going to say that, which is and I mentioned this book to you, but I'll mention it to the group. There's an interesting book called North Enough, AIDS and Other Clear Cuts from 1997 by Jan Zeta Grover, which is half a meditation on the voluntary AIDS care work in San Francisco, and then half a meditation on the North Woods of Minnesota. But it has some very intense discussions of bogs, which is why I thought of it, and wetlands. But as you were talking about the wetland, I was thinking, especially with regard to bogs, it strikes me that bogs operate in part via logics of decay, and in part via logics of like petrification, right? So like things get petrified and preserved, and then things decay, and that's part of the cycle. And so thinking about the bog, which I don't know that much about, but is compelling, I think, to think with or think in, it also raises the question of the relationship between futurity and vitality, because like the future of a bog is not a traditionally vital future in the sense of life making or life giving, and yet it's persisting. And so I part of what interests me, I guess, about, to go back to the kind of 80s context, is how do we understand forms of persisting, forms of lasting, forms of futures that are not about the future of life, right? Or not about life's own future. And what can we learn from various communities that have been deemed external to life in various ways and yet persist, right? And so maybe that's another term that we hadn't thought to talk about, but might be worth bringing up in the conversation, is what is the role of thinking about life as a category in relation to futurity, queer or otherwise? And
this is something that you write about very much, is, you know, you question the value of talking about saving things, that our approaches might be salvific. We need to save the earth. We need to save the whale. And I find in your work this amazing kind of, you're able to address terminality and the ending of life, even the mass ending of life, extinctions, apocalypse. You're able to address these without fear, and to see a kind of set of possibilities that arrive from, you say it all so much better than I can. Maybe I even have the quotation down here that might help. But I'm also aware, actually, that we have been going for almost an hour. It might be a good time to start to throw questions.
I just had one quick comment in response to your point about affect. I do think thinking about affect might be something to talk about in the Q&A, and the question of fear, because I would say for me, I mean, I'm not a stoic, and it's not about not having fear, but I have plenty of fear. But I think this might go back to the point about voluntary, kind of volunteering in the early years of the AIDS crisis as lived in the US, which is to say, I think it's less about like fear or no fear than about really taking seriously forms of work, like care work, care as work, and the kind of dailiness of that, the labor of making community and the labor of making moments and hours and days livable. And so I think it's less about feeling or shutting it off or stoicism or fear, and more about kind of taking seriously the work that has gone in to making things last and making things livable. And I would draw a distinction between livability, making something livable, and kind of life, capital L, as I was talking about it earlier. But I'll stop rambling, because I think we only have like 15 minutes now for Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to top and tail that by saying that maybe the question of mourning is an important one too, because when you enter into care, especially caring for someone with a terminal condition, mourning is part of that process. And it's acceptable and it's fine. And actually, when we translate that, when we scale that up and say, right, okay, now how do we address climate change, the climate crisis? Mourning is a key part of doing that, that understanding that the planet, our home, is changing irreversibly. Coming to terms with that is part of the process, because ultimately, we spoke a little bit about solutions to some things that are coming with climate change. There are no solutions. We just have to be ready. It's about readiness rather than planning.
So, okay, I don't want to have like an endless regress. I promise this will be my last comment before the Q&A. But as you were talking about solutions, I mean, I think at least in literary studies and the environmental humanities, there's always this like overdetermined question, like, oh, can reading literature actually save the world? Right. And for me, that's just not the question. So as opposed to entering into some like overdetermined debate about whether this poem that I teach will save the world, I'm really interested in queer culture and literature as sites that teach, reflect, embody forms of ethical engagement when things cannot be saved, when bodies cannot be saved, when lives cannot be saved, when species cannot be saved. And that's not to be nihilistic. That's to say, like, I just think it changes the terms of the conversation when saving is not the question, but forms of caring and communing and improving and change are still on the table. So yeah, I'll stop talking.
That's great. So let's throw things out. So we can take questions from people who are online, and we can take questions from people in the room. So please, I think just put your hands up in the air. Leah, you.
Yeah, thanks so much for a fascinating discussion, both of you.
Can you hear okay, Sarah?
A little bit louder would help.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I wanted to, I guess, know what you guys think. I guess thinking about caring and in relation, especially to the environment, we come to the issue of like unintended consequences. And I guess also with this idea of futurity and like not knowing what the outcome will be of like a particular action is, I guess, one of the things that's so comforting about a teleological future is that you know the anxiety is kind of gone in a way, because you know what's going to happen. If you do X, then you'll get Y. I guess my question for you would be like, yeah, I guess in this like notion of caring, how do you square like that the intentions might be good, but the outcome might be very different from what you actually were sort of, I guess, looking for, or like that you have a sort of subjunctive or like conditional idea of like, I guess, like we all have like goals or like things that we kind of want. Yeah, don't know if that makes sense.
No, that's a really useful and compelling question. I'm grateful to have the occasion to think with it. I'll just speak off the cuff and let Tim jump in. As you were talking, I was thinking that like one word for what you're describing is collateral damage, right? That like you could do something and it has these unintended consequences. I think one thing that interests me in a lot of queer writing is like taking seriously also the possibility for collateral benefit or collateral flourishing. This kind of like, we tend to think of these indirect things in the register of harm, and certainly they're in the register of harm all the time. But I think if we take seriously unintended consequences across the nature of the consequence, it actually opens up a field of thought that then can help us de-routinize our habits. So just one place I look to this quickly is like Samuel Delaney's famous book, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, about cruising culture in New York City and Times Square being kind of cleaned up or sanitized in the name of family values, with the excuse being like the epidemiological dangers of HIV and AIDS. And so much of that book is about like these kind of avowedly temporary encounters that yield consequence, not at the level of like dyadic relationship, but in the like pleasure, the experience of pleasure then suffusing the city with a kind of pleasantness, or suffusing a scene with a pleasantness. So this is a non-answer, except to say what you're making me think about is like what would be required to just collectively navigate the unintended and the unpredictable, right, in the way that you're describing it, and see if there are ways. This might go back to the question of planning or readiness, actually, because Delaney talks about kind of like, are there ways to design a city to promote the possibility of that kind of like collateral benefit. And so maybe I'm asking about like scaffolding or structures for learning to navigate what just is the unpredictability. And the last thing I'll say is, as you were talking, I was thinking that just to me also describes teaching. So like the great joy of this profession for me is teaching. And one of the great joys and the great horrors of teaching is you never know what's landing. You never know what's going to matter in 20 years. You never know what's going to last, right? So you're doing something kind of temporary and you're setting the stage for all kinds of like lateral and collateral forms of consequence. And so I wonder if like mapping scenes where we know how to think about the collateral would be one way to approach it. And I hope that answered your question, because I couldn't fully hear it. So,
well, but bringing Samuel Delaney into it, I think, is great, because the book is about the sexual encounters he has in theaters in Times Square, and they're all totally imperfect sexual encounters. Like they're all flawed, right?
Yeah.
So there is never this perfect moment, and what he's really after is pleasantness. And what I really like about that is that it kind of demystifies the sexual encounter. With, you know, like all of a sudden the you know, sex and the orgasm, it isn't like Erica Jong's zipless fuck, you know, where it's like it's perfect and the you know the angels sing and the heavens open up and that kind of thing. It just says that maybe the orgasmic is nice, which is actually which is to say it's good enough in the moment, and the contact that's had there is as important as the orgasm or the, you know, anything else in the experience, which to me actually speaks to architecture and landscape architecture, that students get what we call analysis paralysis. They get so focused on getting things right in the project that they can't proceed anymore. They can't design. Whereas actually, if your approach is just to say, I need to do as well as I can with the knowledge I have, that is ultimately all any of us can do in any moment, whether we're presidents of nations or whether we're architects or whether we're meeting people in a cinema for sex. There's like, just to try to be good enough is actually maybe the loftiest ideal.
No, I actually had a thought as you were talking, and this is really useful, and then I'll stop for the next question. But in that book, Delaney described, I think this is right, pleasantness, which to him is like ambient, pleasantness as pleasure at its most generalized, right? And I was thinking about talking about the bog or the wetland, like part of what's happening there is like taking seriously a logic of decay, but a decayed thing still exists, right? Decaying is still persisting. And then I was thinking about, with regard to afterness, there's this book, I'm sure it's behind me, called After Sex, from many years ago, trying to think about like what comes after sex and what comes kind of after the peak of queer theory. And in her contribution, Elizabeth Freeman says they were all asked to think what is least queer about their work. And I think what you're talking about is like the leastness, the most generalized, the kind of decaying but still persisting, like taking that seriously, not as a falling off from peak experience, right? But as like an experience or a mode of existing all its own. So it can sound depressing to say like, give up on the orgasmic and have the pleasant, or, as you're saying, what is enough? But I don't think enoughness needs to be like chastening limitation. There is a kind of like affirmative pleasure in some of these more minimal states. And I do think Delaney's pretty good at navigating the circuitry of it, because it's not just like pleasure diminishing into pleasantness, but pleasantness can be a conduit back to pleasure, right?
Right. So the question from Manuel. Hi, Manuel. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about palliation, perhaps palliation as a potential ethic that could be entangled with queer futurity and or utopianism. Sarah, that might be one, the idea of the palliative is something you've really addressed in your work, especially in and around the question of terminality.
Yeah, I'm looking very quickly if my device will respond. There is a brand new, of course, now everything's going to freeze. One answer is yes, and I have a reference for a brand new article on Indigenous practices of palliative care and environmental humanities. So if I find that, I can send it out. I mean, I think thinking about palliation and the planet is incredibly important and powerful, precisely with regard to habits of care that emerge when saving is no longer possible, but care and communing and continuance are. I think my cautionary note, and this is why I was trying to pull up the article, is that when people have written, others that I've read have written about palliation and the planet, it often ends up resorting to this like, again, kind of sense of resignation or nihilism. There's a bunch of articles, they're like, well, we can't save the planet, but we can like make sure that our local ecosystem is still okay. Or we can't do this, but we can do this. And I genuinely don't mean, when I try to think about palliation, I do not mean it as resignation. And that may be in part because a lot of this work for me came about by being proximate to people who were dying and seeing the kind of care work involved. And so for me, I'd want to link palliation to things like death doulaing and HIV doulaing and this kind of like resurgence, abortion doulaing, this like resurgence of interest in politicized practices of doulaing that are about collectives and political change and not solely about individual relationships, although that's clearly part of the point. And if Tim picks up, I can try to find the reference I'm looking for.
Well, I think that there are more sinister narratives that the abandoning of possible futures leads to, and that's the growth of like eco-fascism and
Yes.
the Elon Muskian Mars exit, like we just give up. Everything is going to die, therefore we have to figure out how we're going to survive on Mars. Or I think Kim Stanley Robinson is perhaps one of our most direct writers on this, and he doesn't abandon futures at all. He says, we will be challenged, but human life on Earth will most likely continue in some form or another. So, again, like for me, that's about readiness. That's about not abandoning possibilities. And then
I found, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just to say quickly that I think that the kind of eco-fascist impulse is to retreat into enclaves, which gives you this kind of dystopian Octavia Butler sort of parable of the sower kind of dystopian future. Although there is a utopian undercurrent in the parable of the sower, which becomes much more visible at the end, and it's an ecological narrative. It's the kind of seeds beneath the snow kind of future possibilities emerging in that book. So, and it's a good thing that's there, because it's otherwise such a devastating
I'm actually, tomorrow's our last day of class and I'm teaching that book this week, so it's a questionable note to end on maybe. I found the article, which is in Environmental Humanities Journal, March 2023, called Practicing Palliation for Extinction and Climate Change, Weaving Death Ethics from Story and Practice. And I opened the Terminal Regions article that Tim circulated with this, but in 1989, when Bill McKibben wrote The End of Nature, which was thought to be the text that first introduced mainstream American audiences to the idea of global climate change and its seriousness, there he says that like the reason that in 89, he's claiming that the reason it's difficult to get people to care about environmental stewardship is that, he says, the planet is terminally ill and we don't easily befriend the terminally ill. And like that was the spur for that version of the project, which was to say in 1989, as Tim pointed out, tens of thousands of Americans were making friends with or continuing to befriend the terminally ill amidst the kind of voluntary forms of caretaking that needed to emerge amidst the AIDS crisis. And so this also is, to go back to the original point from Tim, like a question of institutional abandonment and responses, political and ethical. And I would disaggregate those to institutional abandonment, including in higher education. So I've also been thinking about like defunding of entire universities in the UK, programs in gender studies and ethnic studies in the US right now, including there was just a bill introduced today in my own state. So I do think kind of, again, things I'd like to map together would be forms of care amidst these institutional abandonment structures.
We probably have time for one last question. Does anyone have any more?
I'm just going to switch my camera on. Hi, everyone.
Hi,
thanks so much for the really stimulating discussion. I really enjoyed it. And I think yeah, I've been left with the feeling that somehow No Future did open up the possibility of thinking the future in lots of different ways. So it had some kind of collateral benefit, even despite the critiques that you've opened up and that others have opened up as well. But just bearing in mind some of the other critiques of No Future, which were kind of very much focused on not just homonormative politics, but kind of urban politics. So Munoz's writing about you know, the kind of Times Square development that you alluded to with the Samuel Delaney book and the elimination of spaces of kind of culture and creativity. I was thinking, you know, just to ask you a little bit, given that we're in this queer urbanism series, and since that you've opened that up in so many different scales compared to the other sessions that we've had, I think, I was just wondering if you could reflect, or if you do reflect on the city and the urban and urbanism in your work. I mean, I think the reference to Samuel Delaney suggests that you do, but I guess my question is, how does urban or urbanism feature in your accounts of queer futurity, or what would be the kind of spaces that you might associate with the discourses that you've been discussing, whether you see sort of hope in queer urbanism in relation to your sort of ecological, queer ecological thinking?
No, thank you for that. I have two answers that may be non-answers, but that I genuinely thought of as you were talking. So we'll see what happens. Maybe it's a two-part answer, a single answer. So I used to joke that I am a queer theorist who doesn't think about sex and an eco-critic who doesn't think about nature. And those things are perhaps no longer entirely the case and may indicate that I don't care about nouns, to go back to the point about futures. But I do think I've been thinking about cities for a long time, and Delaney is the clearest example, but your question in the wake of this conversation made me think that I think what interests me is scenes of proximity within sites of distance, and then the scenes of distance within sites of proximity, right? So like the logic of urbanism that Delaney seems to be working with would stereotypically, if just described in a caricatured sense, be like all about proximity, bodies meeting in the theater and parting and meeting. But the kind of, obviously the like height of the narrative are these scenes of meeting, of physical proximity. And yet for me, the real ecological dimension is like, again, how the pleasure spreads into pleasantness and how these encounters persist and become diffuse and are no less powerful and no less galvanizing for that. In fact, he's like really attending to the galvanizing power, I think, of temporal and spatial spread and relationships across distance. And inversely, the way I first came to any of this work was reading these late 19th century works of American regionalism, so set like in small town Maine and on the coast, where relationships are nominally quite distant. People are living at great distances, from the mainland to the island, across the distances of death. And I was trying to find language for the forms of like emotional proximity that were being felt across those geographic and temporal distances. So now this is like some kind of strange hand gesture, like the moving of a lung or something. But I think I'm intrigued by like the meeting of apparent opposites, right? So finding intimacy and distance, and then finding spread and diffusion amidst scenes that seem to be about closeness. And so maybe that's where the queerness comes in for me.
I might add to that my perspective is a perspective coming from landscape studies, and I would say that's a more broad sensibility than landscape architecture, perhaps, as a thing. And I would tend to see cities and rural areas as existing on a continuum and being interdependent. So from my perspective, queer urbanism is only part of the picture, because there's this whole question about what it means to be queer and living in the urban shadow, or what it means to be a peri-urban queer or a rural queer. All of these things are interconnected in really interesting ways, and questions about futures there, I think, are particularly important, because we need to start thinking the rural differently. We need to start inhabiting the rural differently. We need to start queering the rural in really meaningful ways, and not just thinking of queerness as something that is an urban phenomenon, because that's only the particular moment that we're in. So I think there are some imperatives that landscapes throw up that are important to consider. And I think that there's also a real importance in questioning some of the kind of key narratives. I don't know how many papers I've read in recent years that say, we are an urbanizing planet, population is growing, as though those things are inevitable and can't be thought differently or planned differently. I really believe that what we need for sustainable futures, for coming to terms with climate change, is a peopled landscape, is to make sure that we have people everywhere tending to places, that we have stewardship in action, and that requires all the elements of society that you find in the city. It requires queer aunties and uncles as much as it does people who are fathering and mothering rural landscapes into existence. So I would just make an insistence from my point of view that queer urbanism is a realm that needs to expand. So let's wrap it up now. Thank you again to B.Queer and everyone for having us and for facilitating this. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us remotely. I'm really glad that these hybrid events are able to happen in the way that they are, and that we're able to bring this wonderful conversation we've been having to this room without flights and big budgets and all that kind of thing.
No, thank you to everyone.